This meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee will come to order. The hearing on the gun violence epidemic, a public health crisis, is today's topic. The committee will hear from public health experts who've been on the front lines of gun violence epidemic. They understand the pain of a loved one whose family member has been taken away too soon by the pull of a trigger, and they've seen the aftermath of bullets tearing through bone like it's tissue paper. In cities like Chicago, dealing with the constant drumbeat of gun violence has turned these public health professionals into battlefield experts. Chicago faces the same challenges as many other cities and towns. In fact, many rural areas have even higher rates of gun violence than the urban areas. Across the country, gun violence is a public health epidemic, plain and simple. In 2022, there were more than 48,000 firearm-related deaths in the United States. That's 132 Americans every day dying from gun violence. More than half of firearm-related deaths were suicides. More than 4 out of 10 were homicides. And guns are now the #1 cause of death among America's children and teenagers. Not auto accidents, not cancer, guns. I'm going to share a video that shows the devastation left in the wake of gun violence and provides a glimpse into heroic efforts to heal communities and prevent future violence. I'm going to warn the audience that the video is disturbing and may be upsetting to some if they wish to avert their eyes. Please play the video.
Foundations, community organizations, and corporations have all stepped up to support initiatives that holistically address the root causes of this cycle of violence.
I think reframing this as a public health crisis, I'm an infectious disease specialist. Many of people in my field have actually turned to gun violence, recognizing that gun violence behaves like an infectious disease. It is contagious. Violence is passed on from person to person.
Collecting data, identifying trends, developing strategies to prevent harm, reducing risk, sharing these practices, this is how you combat an epidemic. It's worked in the past. We use the same public health approach to dramatically cut automobile fatalities. We still drive where we need to go, but we have seatbelts and speed limits that help us get there alive. Public health experts are already working to address gun violence in real time. Last year, Congress passed the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I want to salute my colleague, Senator Cornyn, who is here with us today, representing the minority. It took real courage, John. We may disagree on a lot of issues, but at a time when we needed to act, you did your best, and I thank you for that. It included $250 million in funding for community violence intervention and $250 million for states to provide comprehensive community mental health services. Let me give one example of the successful, innovative programs underway. In Chicago, I heard from doctors personally who were sick of treating gunshot victims on the operating table. They wanted to prevent the gruesome injuries from happening in the first place. So in 2018, I brought together the CEOs of the 10 largest hospitals serving Chicago to understand what they were doing in the neighborhoods surrounding their hospitals and how we can do more. We formed the Chicago HEAL Initiative, which has emerged as a national exemplar of how hospitals can collaborate and reach outside their walls to prevent gun violence. These hospitals have increased local hiring by 84% in the last 4 years. They've opened 24 school-based health clinics to serve 11,000 students and are training nearly 4,000 local students for careers in healthcare. Most importantly, these hospitals aren't just stitching up physical injuries. They're addressing the emotional scars of their patients. Through counseling and case management to prevent retaliation and promote successful recovery, just 2% of over 8,000 participating patients at the University of Chicago have returned to the hospital. Without these programs and this initiative, 45% of patients with a gunshot wound are likely to return within 5 years with another one. That is a stunning statistic. 45% within 5 years will return shot a second time. Similar steps are underway across the country to use this strategy, which is known as community violence intervention. CVI uses trusted community figures to engage with individuals at high risk of perpetrating or being victims of violence. They work to interrupt acts of violence before they happen and connect people with treatment and tools that decrease the risk of future violence. It's time for us to build on this bipartisan Safer Communities Act and ongoing efforts that are working in red and blue states. And join together, surely we can find some common ground between parties to create real change for the American people when it comes to this public health crisis of gun violence. I now turn to Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few months ago, the Democratic governor of New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, issued a, quote, public health emergency order to suspend the right to bear arms in Albuquerque and surrounding Bernalillo County. I think I pronounced that correctly. She was warned repeatedly by officials in her state that such a suspension violated the Constitution. A group of our colleagues here, including Senators Tillis, Graham, Kennedy, Blackburn, and Cotton, and I wrote to the Department of Justice to intervene and protect the constitutional rights of New Mexicans to carry a firearm outside of their home. Our request was consistent with the Second Amendment and the court's jurisprudence, and I expect that the court of last resort will find the same. But unfortunately, that doesn't mark the end of the road for this latest attack on what is a constitutional right. That's something some of our colleagues consistently overlook. And the fact is that a firearm in the hands of a law-abiding citizen is not a threat to public safety. Indeed, there's a story, I think it's in the Washington Post today, by Philip Bump, who points out that 52% of American households have a firearm in that household, 52%. Washington Democrats have unfortunately chosen to follow Governor Grisham's lead and are now using public health as a guise to address their concerns. I wish they had the same concerns about the #1 cause of death for Americans between the age of 18 and 45, which is fentanyl poisoning. Fentanyl made from chemical precursors from China going to Mexico, made to look like relatively innocuous pharmaceuticals, which are then smuggled into the United States. And unfortunately, many young people end up consuming what they think is a relatively innocuous drug and die as a result of fentanyl poisoning. Well, we don't have to look far to see that examples of executive overreach that have relied on so-called public health emergencies. During the COVID-19 pandemic, too many politicians were quick to shut down houses of worship and church services while allowing other businesses and other organizations to operate. Here in Washington, D.C., for example, Mayor Muriel Bowser refused to allow the Capitol Hill Baptist Church to hold outdoor church services because of a public health emergency. The judge in that case found that the mayor had exceeded her authority and had substantially burdened the free exercise of religion. It's important to note that the application of these so-called public health precautions was not even-handed. While many politicians deemed it unsafe for businesses to operate or churchgoers to attend worship services, they seemed to have no problem with packed BLM riots, as in Black Lives Matter riots in the summer of 2020 that caused millions of dollars worth of damages. So we have a trust issue and a constitutional issue when we use the public health approach to attempt to strip away core constitutional rights. The other problem with the public health approach is that the most effective solution to firearm-related homicides and assault is effective criminal law enforcement. That means effective police, prosecutors, courts, and prisons. We know that these tools actually work. We know they work because we have historical data in order to prove it. As law enforcement efforts were stepped up in the early and mid-1990s, we saw dramatic declines in criminal violence of all kinds. One of the reasons for this is that the concentration of gun violence is among small numbers of the population. It's not the general population, it's a small percentage of the population where this phenomenon exists. In Washington, D.C., for example, in 2021, a study found that only 500 people were responsible for up to 70% of the gun violence in the district. In Boston, a 28-year-old study found that half of the city's homicides were committed by 1% of the population, involved with gangs primarily. A 2014 study showed a similar situation in Chicago. What all of this means, I believe, is that if you empower law enforcement to selectively investigate and prosecute repeat offenders, you can dramatically reduce the gun violence in a community where it's a problem. By removing the worst criminal elements from the community, everyone is safer. That's the original purpose of the Project Safe Neighborhoods program, which passed out of the Senate this year. That program focuses on investigating and prosecuting the most dangerous and violent criminals in our communities to ensure they do not continue to harm other people. And we've seen over the last 2+ decades, it's had an overwhelming success rate at reducing violent crime. Successful programs like Project Safe Neighborhoods require both resources and political will. You can't simply achieve safer communities by defunding the police or letting violent offenders out on bail like, unfortunately, too many prosecutors have been willing to do in communities across our country. Today, violent crime is ravaging many of our communities, and the public is, of course, taking notice, as they must. Here in the District of Columbia, carjackings are up dramatically. And I have to believe that a lot of this has to do with the perception that there will not be consequences associated with committing such crimes against innocent citizens, including members of the United States Congress. A recent Gallup poll showed that 63% of Americans describe the crime problem in the U.S. as either extremely serious or very serious. That's the highest level since this particular poll began in 2000. And 77% of Americans believe there is more crime today in the United States than there was just a year ago. Again, when we talk about the gun violence epidemic, it seems as though a substantial part of that debate is our current crime problem, which has spiked due to the left's soft on crime policies and the defund the police movement. Of course, we know the other side of the gun violence issue is mental health. This is especially important when we include firearm-related suicides, as the chairman said. About 60% of the gun deaths in America are the result of a suicide, someone taking their own life. And of course, we know that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which we did pass, made the single largest investment in community-based mental health care in American history. A good start. In 2023, a survey from Mental Health America found that 21% of American adults have claimed symptoms of a mental illness. That's 50 million Americans. A 2015 study published by the Annals of Epidemiology found mental illness is strongly associated with increased risk of suicide, which accounts, as I said, for more than half of the gun-related deaths in this country. Suicide is a mental health problem, and we're not going to fix the issue by denying people their constitutional right to keep and bear arms. at least among the general population. Countries like Belgium, Japan, South Korea all have higher suicide rates than the United States, but don't have a Second Amendment. Mental health problems are also often involved in mass shootings, as we know. In the wake of the Buffalo and Uvalde shootings, we looked at the profile of these mass shooters and found that many of them had serious underlying mental health problems, mental health issues that were unaddressed and untreated. Many of our colleagues, including Senator Tillis, Graham, Durbin, and Coons, and many others, worked together, as you've heard, to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I think that bill has already saved lives. I get regular updates of the success of that law as it deals with mental health and violence in our communities. But there are other parts of the bill that are working as well. Since the law was enacted in June of 2022, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, new criminal penalties and firearm trafficking had led to more than 100 new charges against dangerous cartel members and firearms traffickers. The enhanced juvenile records check alone has stopped 400 transactions of people who would ordinarily flunk a background check were they an adult and you only check their adult mental health and criminal history. But now, because we have an enhanced check that include juvenile records, 400 transactions have been stopped, while 98.5% of the background check system is unaffected. This, of course, builds on the positive changes that came from a bill we called Fix NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check Act, which was signed into law by President Trump in 2018. That law has led to the uploading of millions of new records into the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check database to prevent those who are already legally prohibited from possessing a firearm under existing law from obtaining one. All this was done, both Fix NICS and the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, in a bipartisan way without infringing the rights of law-abiding citizens. The point is, we can find ways to come together to get things done, but using public health authorities as a blanket excuse to strip away constitutional rights or framing gun violence as an epidemic divides us more than it unites us. And it really kind of misses the point. These are not autonomously fired weapons. They involve human agency. And as we've seen, when we focus on the humans, we can have a very positive impact. So I hope we look at the entire picture of gun violence, which includes focusing on repetitive acts of violence by a small percentage of our communities, focusing on mental health diagnosis and treatment, and finding ways that we can address gun violence like we did in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Again, all without infringing on the rights of law-abiding citizens. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. And you've raised some very important issues like fentanyl, which we've had hearings in this committee about the issue of narcotics and what's happening to America. President Biden recently raised this issue with the leader of China. I hope that it leads to something positive in diminishing the supply on that side of it. You raised the issues of freedom of religion, which is important to all of us and is discussed frequently in this committee. You've talked about funding the police. I believe that funding the police is critical. I've never said otherwise. I hope that on some of the spending bills that our Republican friends will start voting for them when they find funding for the police included. That should be a bipartisan effort. But the one thing that you don't acknowledge and we disagree on is the fact that the United States of America is unique among nations. Unique among nations. There is no other country, developed economy in this world where the #1 cause of death among children and teenagers is guns, period. We are a unique nation in many ways, but this is something we shouldn't take pride in. And to address it at this hearing, I think, is appropriate and timely. The white coats that are represented in the audience here are men and women who have given their life to medicine and have to face the products of these violent actions and try to keep these poor people alive for another day. And yet we know that doing nothing means that 45% of them are going to return with another gunshot wound. What is wrong with this picture? Even if it is a limited number of people who are engaged in it, are we going to turn our back on the fact that 122 Americans die every single day by gun wounds? That is a fact in our country and no other country. When it comes to mental illness, other countries face mental illness every day as well, but they don't turn to guns or wanton violence as an alternative in the way they do in the United States. That is entirely unique to our country. Before we return to our witnesses, let me briefly lay out the mechanics. After I swear the witnesses in, they'll have 5 minutes each to provide an opening statement, and then a round of questions where each senator will have 5 minutes to ask. We welcome 5 witnesses, and I'm going to introduce the majority witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Megan Ranney. Dr. Ranney is the Dean of the Yale School of Public Health, board-certified emergency physician and violence prevention researcher. She's been a leading national voice for addressing firearm injuries as public health problem for well over 10 years. Thank you. We're joined as well by Dr. Franklin Cozy Gay. Dr. Cozy Gay is Director of Violence Recovery Program at the University of Chicago Medicine, which helps trauma patients and their families with crisis intervention and social service. In 5 years, the program has grown 800%, serving over 8,000 participants, and employs more than 20 specialists who are themselves either gun violence survivors or family members of gun violence victims. Our final majority witness is Vaughn Bryant. Mr. Bryant's the Executive Director of Metropolitan Peace Initiatives, which is based in Chicago. MPI focuses on community violence intervention by providing trauma-informed behavioral health service, building a citywide network of outreach workers, and enhancing community capacity to reduce violence. I now turn the floor over to Senator Cornyn to introduce the minority witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Swerer, Amy Swerer is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Her areas of scholarship include the Second Amendment, overcriminalization, school safety, and the intersection of mental health and gun violence. She runs Heritage's Defense Gun Use Database and is the primary author of Heritage's recent ebook, The Essential Second Amendment. She earned her JD and undergraduate degrees from the University of Nebraska. Mr. Stephen Cook, who's been a frequent witness here before the committee, served with the Department of Justice for 33 years, including 30 years as a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Tennessee. Between 2017 and 2019, he served as Associate Deputy Attorney General and Director of Law Enforcement Affairs. In that capacity, he led 2 of DOJ's priority programs, violent crime reduction and strengthening the DOJ's relationship with state and local law enforcement. Before joining the DOJ, Mr. Cook worked as a police officer for 7 years. Presently, Mr. Cook serves as a general counsel for both the Major Cities Chiefs Association and the Major County Sheriffs of America. And he also serves as outside counsel for the Federal Law Enforcement Officers